Berlin, April 1924. You are standing at the graveside of Hugo Stinnes. 6 months ago, this man controlled 1,535 companies. He employed 600,000 workers. Roughly 1 German in 6 worked for him in some capacity. The newspapers called him the inflation king. He borrowed paper marks by the mountain and used them to buy steel mills, coal mines, hotels, newspapers, and ocean shipping lines before the money could lose another zero. He looked like the only man in Germany who had beaten the system. He is 53 years old, he is dead, and his empire is already beginning to collapse around him. His sons Hugo Jr. and Edmund are 28 and 27. They inherited everything. His last words to them were a warning. "What is credit for me," he told them, "are debts for you." Nobody listened. Within a year, the empire that had looked invincible during the inflation would be carved apart and sold off piece by piece, because currency stabilization had done what the hyperinflation could not. It had made debts real again. Here is the first thing most people who watched the Weimar Protocol video got wrong when they asked what happened next. They assumed the people who held gold or land or foreign currency or silver through the hyperinflation must have come out well and stayed well. The forensic record is more complicated than that, and considerably more useful. By the end of this video, you will know exactly what happened to each category of hard asset holder across the full decade from 1921 to 1932, including the Great Depression. You will know about the most devastating legal verdict in German financial history, one that obliterated savings while rewarding a specific class of holder. And you will know what a decade of German financial history actually teaches about the purpose of holding hard assets, which turns out to be a different lesson from the one most people expect. Let's open the autopsy. Before we can understand what happened to hard asset holders after the crisis, we need to understand the official story and what the forensic record actually says. The official story is this. November 15th, 1923. The Rentenmark is introduced. Hyperinflation ends. Germany stabilizes, rebuilds, and enters the golden 20s. A period of prosperity follows. Then 1929 arrives and the Depression hits. A sad story, but a contained one. The forensic record tells a completely different story. The first thing the forensic record shows is what happened to savings holders when the dust settled, and it is a table that should be tattooed on the inside of every investor's eyelids. In 1924, the Reichsmark replaced the Rentenmark at pre-war gold parity, 4.2 Reichsmarks per US dollar. The pre-war 20-mark gold coin, which contained 7.16 grams of pure gold, was now worth exactly 20 Reichsmarks. Gold holders came out 100% whole. Now here is what everyone else received. Mortgage creditors got back 25% of face value if they had held for 5 or more years. Corporate bondholders got 15 to 25%, with payments delayed years. Government war bond holders got 2.5% of face value, 2.5 cents on the dollar, payable after reparations. Commercial bank account holders received nothing, total loss. Savings bank depositors received essentially nothing under a pooling formula, so complex and so stingy that even lawyers struggled to explain it. This was codified in the Aufwertungsgesetz, the revaluation law of July 16, 1925, after 2 years of political and legal battle. The Reichsgericht, Germany's Supreme Court, had issued a landmark ruling in November 1923 invoking the Civil Code's good faith clause to demand some revaluation. The Savers League organised. A political party formed specifically to demand justice for inflation victims. 2 of its candidates won Reichstag seats in 1928. By 1930, its disillusioned voters had largely migrated to the Nazi Party. The rentier class, those living on fixed income investments, had been 15% of the German population in 1913. By 1925, they were 3%. 12% of the German population had been financially annihilated and given back 2.5 cents on the dollar. And the reason the government could not be more generous, according to Federal Reserve Governor Benjamin Strong, was that generous revaluation would have caused American loans to dry up. The ruined German saver was sacrificed to keep foreign capital flowing. Physical gold holders received everything. Everyone else received pennies or nothing. This is the forensic record. Now here is the surprise. The forensic record does not stop in 1924, and the decade that followed created a second, more psychologically interesting problem for hard asset holders. One that the conventional Weimar story almost never tells. From 1924 to 1929, Germany rebuilt on a flood of American capital. The Dawes Plan, negotiated in 1924 by Chicago banker Charles Dawes, and General Electric chairman Owen Young opened the door. J.P. Morgan arranged an initial 800 million Reichsmark loan at 7%. American banks then competed furiously to lend more. Thomas Lamont of Morgan described in 1927 a horde of American bankers sitting on doorsteps and offering money. Between 1924 and 1930, Germany absorbed 29 billion Reichsmarks in foreign loans. American capital accounted for 70% of Germany's gross capital imports by 1928. The results were visible and real. National income rose 25% between 1925 and 1928. Industrial output doubled. German stocks rose 163% in real terms over 17 months. Bank deposits paid interest. Real estate appreciated. The economy was alive. And if you were sitting on physical gold coins earning nothing, watching a rebuilt Germany around you, you looked like the most cautious and conservative and boring person in the room. This is the second thing the forensic record shows. The Golden Twenties were real enough to create genuine pressure on hard asset holders to capitulate, to convert, to participate, to stop leaving money on the table. Sebastian Haffner, the German journalist who lived through every year of this period and wrote about it with extraordinary precision, described the Stresemann years with exactly this tone. There was an ample measure of freedom, peace, and order, he wrote. Everyone was cordially invited to concentrate on their personal lives. The surface looked stable, and for people who had survived 5 years of crisis and were being told the crisis was over, it looked like the right time to trust the system again. Most people did, and that brings us to the third thing the forensic record shows. The third thing is what happened when 1929 arrived, and it arrived in Germany in stages which made it worse. First came the warnings that were ignored. The German stock market had peaked earlier than the American one. Reichsbank President Hjalmar Schacht, the same man who had engineered the stabilization, forced Berlin banks to cut margin credit in May 1927, causing stocks to fall 13% in a single day. Cambridge economic historian Hans-Joachim Voth later demonstrated that Schacht was wrong, that there was no bubble, that German stocks were actually still below their 1913 levels, even at the so-called height of the boom. The intervention damaged investment confidence and contributed to Germany's vulnerability. Second came the withdrawal of American capital in late 1928, a full year before Wall Street crashed. 55% of Germany's capital inflows had been short-term, callable at any time. The call came. Third came the banking collapse. Austria's Kreditanstalt failed in May 1931. Contagion reached Germany within weeks. Danert Bank, one of Germany's major commercial banks, disclosed on July 13, 1931, that it could not meet its commitments. The government declared a bank holiday. Dresdner Bank failed alongside it. 4 of Germany's 5 leading commercial banks were placed under public control, July 14, 1931. Germany suspended gold convertibility and imposed exchange controls. The Reichsmark, restored at pre-war gold parity only 7 years earlier, was now cut off from gold. Now, let's go down the list. Stocks collapsed. The people who had watched stocks rise 163% in 1925 to 1927 and finally capitulated and bought in watched them destroyed. Bank deposits, frozen and largely lost when the major banks failed. German government bonds and corporate debt, devastated by the deflationary spiral. Real estate, foreclosures accelerated as unemployment rose above 30% by early 1932. Foreign currency held outside the banking system. Those who had held physical dollars or pounds or Swiss francs outside the system maintained full purchasing power, just as they had during the hyperinflation. The mechanism was identical. Assets outside the institution survived. Assets inside did not. Physical gold. Gold's purchasing power increased approximately 20 to 25% during 1929 to 1932 in Germany, not because gold rose in nominal terms, but because prices fell sharply, while gold's value held steady. In a deflationary collapse, gold preserves and prices fall toward it. Physical land under direct personal control. Farmers who had paid off mortgages with worthless marks during the inflation were partially reversed by the Aufwertung, which reinstated mortgages at 25%. But the farmers who had land with no debt and could feed themselves maintained a floor. The families that kept productive land through both crises were not prosperous by 1932, but they were not destroyed. That is the forensic record across the full decade. Now here is the part most people still haven't thought through. The German gold holder who held physical coins from 1921 to 1932 survived two separate systemic collapses, survived the Aufwertung that eliminated savings, survived the banking collapse that destroyed deposits, survived the Great Depression that wiped out stocks and bonds and real estate. And at the end of it, they were merely whole. Not rich, not rewarded with a windfall, whole. The American experience was different. When Franklin Roosevelt revalued gold from $20.67 per ounce to $35 in January 1934, American gold holders received a 69% nominal gain. The German government gave its gold holders no such bonus. The Reichsmark maintained nominal gold parity even after suspending free convertibility. The reward for a decade of discipline and refusing to capitulate during the Golden Twenties boom was this: you were the only person in Germany who was not financially destroyed. You did not profit. You were preserved. This is the distinction the forensic record forces on us. Preservation is not the same as profit, and the entire period from 1921 to 1932 is one long documented argument for the value of an asset whose purpose is not to grow, but to survive. There is an uncomfortable modern parallel here. Central banks have purchased more than 3,200 tons of gold in the last 3 years. In 2022, net purchases hit 1,136 tons, the highest since records began in the 1950s. Poland's central bank, the country that lived through hyperinflation in 1923, is now the world's most aggressive gold buyer, targeting 20% of its reserves in physical metal. These are not the actions of institutions confident in the long-term stability of paper currency. These are the actions of institutions preparing for an Aufwertung decision, a moment when a government must choose whether to restore the purchasing power of savers or inflate its way out. The forensic record from 1925 tells us clearly which choice governments make when the pressure is on. United States gross national debt passed $38 trillion in early 2026. Annual interest costs surpassed $1.2 trillion, more than Medicare, more than national defense, and nearly tripled from where they were 5 years earlier. These numbers are not arguments. They are the same table that existed in Germany before the verdict, expressed in current figures. The question the forensic record asks is not whether something will happen. The question is whether you understand what preservation actually means before you need it to mean something. Here is what the Austrian comparison adds. Austria stabilized in 1922 and introduced the shilling in 1925. It earned the nickname the Alpine dollar. Then in May 1931, Credit Anstalt collapsed. The bank controlling more than half of Austria's bank balance sheets announced losses equal to 85% of its equity. Depositors who had trusted the stabilization and returned their savings to Austrian banks lost everything again. Physical gold holders, physical foreign currency holders, holders of productive land survived again. Same assets, same mechanism, different country, different decade. Hungary's pengo appeared stable through the late 1920s, then the Depression destroyed its agricultural base. Poland stabilized in 1924 and clung to gold parity so rigidly through the Depression that deflationary policy made the collapse worse than necessary. 3 countries, 3 different paths through the same decade. The same asset survived each time. The instrument changes with the era. The mechanism does not. The forensic protocol, what the documented record from 1921 to 1932 actually shows preserved wealth through 2 separate crises, comes down to 4 things. The first is physical metal held outside the institutional system, not accounts denominated in precious metals, not certificates redeemable for gold, physical gold and silver coins that did not pass through a bank, a brokerage, or a government registry. The Aufwertung could not reach them. The banking collapse of 1931 could not freeze them. When the Reichsmark suspended convertibility, they still held purchasing power. The mechanism was simple. Assets the institution cannot see cannot be reached by the institution's failure. Today the modern equivalent is physical metal held in private non-bank storage, outside the financial reporting infrastructure. The principle is identical to 1923. The second is productive land under direct personal control, not real estate as investment, not agricultural funds. Land you control, with food-producing capacity you can access without a functioning credit system. German farmers who held productive land without debt remained above a floor through both crises. The land did not appreciate, but it did not vanish when the banks closed. The third is hard currency held outside the banking system. Physical dollars or Swiss francs or pounds held at home rather than in a deposit account. Erna von Pustow, whose interviews with Pearl Buck document the texture of this period in extraordinary detail, described how ordinary Germans discovered that the most important distinction was not between which currency they held, but whether their savings were inside the institution or outside it. The institution can freeze what it can see. It cannot reach what it cannot find. The fourth is understanding the difference between a boom and a recovery. The 5 years from 1924 to 1929 were real enough to feel permanent. National income was rising. Stocks rose 163%. The city was being rebuilt. People who had survived the hyperinflation and watched this unfold faced a genuine and documented temptation to participate. The ones who capitulated and converted hard assets into German stocks and bank deposits in 1926 or 1927 were not foolish. They were responding rationally to visible evidence. They were financially destroyed by 1932. A boom built on short-term foreign capital, with 55% of inflows callable at any time, is not the same as a recovery. The phone call came in late 1928. Hafner's final verdict on the Stressman years is precise. The Republic's capacity for private happiness, he wrote, had been fatally sapped by the events of 1914 to 1924. Under the illusion of normality, the Nazi revolution was steadily gaining ground. The inflation king's sons buried their father in April 1924. The empire lasted about a year. Stinnes had been right about hard assets and wrong about leverage. His sons discovered that the gap between those two things was large enough to bury an empire in. And here is what the forensic record from 1921 to 1932 ultimately shows. The people who held hard assets through the hyperinflation, and then held them through the golden 20s, and then held them through the banking collapse of 1931, were not rewarded with extraordinary returns. They were not made wealthy by their discipline. They were made whole. In a decade that financially destroyed 12% of the German population in the first crisis, and then returned to destroy much of the rest in the second. Being whole was not a consolation prize. It was the only prize that existed. The purpose of the asset was not to multiply wealth in good times. It was to preserve wealth through bad ones. The Weimar forensic record is often presented as an argument for gold. The more accurate reading is that it is an argument for understanding what you own and why you own it, before you need to know. Subscribe to independent